here.
Ryan McCaffrey with IGN alongside Tom Marks. Tom, you have the lucky privilege of having just spent 2 full work days totaling 16 hours of time playing Cyberpunk 2077. There's obviously a million things I could ask you coming out of 16 hours. Top level, give it to me quickly. Like, what is your big takeaway? And we'll just talk about a few things here after 16 hours with this highly anticipated game.
I really enjoyed it. Is the major takeaway, and I want to play more. I think my biggest kind of surprise is it's probably a much slower paced RPG than maybe a lot of people are expecting, and it's a slower paced RPG than maybe the kind of adrenaline pumping first person shooter combat would lead you to believe.
Right.
But I don't say slow paced as in it's too slow. It's just, this is very much an RPG, not an action game. And that's probably going to be great news to a lot of people. It's just, yeah, that caught me off guard. It took me 6 full hours of gameplay to reach the title card of the game. And that was, again, those 6 hours were really fun, but yeah, this is a slow burn of a game, and it wants to be that.
Yeah, I got to play it for the first preview back in June. I played the first 4 hours, starting with prologue, and I kind of came away. I had a similar experience where I barely got any combat at all. In that, like, not until the end of the, like, basically hour 3.5 of the 4-hour time I had. And I think you had a similar thing, right? There's just a lot of either downtime here if you want there to be, or you can choose to throw your fists and guns right into the thick of things too, right?
Anywhere between 4 and probably 7 hours is how long it'll take you to get through that prologue. And then once that's over, the game really just says, go ahead. Here's a laundry list of side quests. Here's the main sort of things you should be doing. Do whatever you want. There's no restrictions on the city. Have fun. And that's really, really kind of, invigorating and exciting. But one of the major differences between Cyberpunk 2077 and a game like The Witcher 3 or Fallout 4, these other kind of open world RPGs that people are going to be comparing it to, I think very rightly in its structure, is that unlike those games, combat and movement, like travel, are not intrinsically linked, right?
Yeah.
In The Witcher or Fallout, if you wanted to get from point A to point B, you're probably gonna have to fight some things on the way there, whereas this takes place in a city, and yeah, it's a lawless city, but it's still just a city, and it's more like GTA in that feeling, where it's like, if you want to get from point A to point B, you just kind of have to go from point A to point B. Which means, since it's an RPG, you can go hours and hours if you want without ever pulling a gun, right? Like, you can just play the whole game, having conversations with people, going through the more story side of things, playing stealthily and not doing an action game if you want that. Or, if you want it, you can seek out fights, and they're basically around every corner. There's tons of little markers on the mini-map for, oh, there's this gang that needs to be dealt with, or, oh, you need to sneak into this little thing, and there's lots of little fights to have, but you need to go looking for a fight if you want a fight in this game.
Now, I'm curious your opinion here. I'm glad you brought The Witcher 3 up, because that's obviously, a lot of people are huge fans of that game. It's one of the best role-playing games, certainly of the past generation. For me, the first time I saw Cyberpunk 2077, I guess 2 E3s ago, or however many real E3s ago it was, I can't keep track of time anymore, it gave me a really heavy Deus Ex vibe. And I'm talking the original Deus Ex, Warren Spector, from the year 2000. And the things you're saying are kind of reinforcing that, and the time I spent playing it feels the same way too. I think it's important to note that this isn't really a first-person shooter, is it? It is a role-playing game through and through.
Frankly, it's up to outside of combat, it's a role-playing game through and through. It feels like an RPG, right? But in combat, you can make it a first-person shooter if you want. And one thing I will say is, I think that the first-person shooting, the action part of it, was probably and I say this generously, like probably the weaker parts of what I played, right? The combat didn't really blow me away in the way that like just driving around Night City did. Driving around Night City and the world and the stories it was telling were really stunning to me. Whereas the combat was just like fun, right? It wasn't bad by any means. It was just like, it was good. But to what you're saying, yeah, it doesn't have to be a first-person shooter if you don't want it to be. I did an entire story mission where I took out, descending through 4 levels of this facility full of bad guys, and I didn't draw my gun a single time. I did the entire thing stealthily through hacking, through, pinging cameras and finding out where everybody is and then distracting them, and it was entirely a stealth game. But somebody else could just go through that with a shotgun and go loud and do that that way instead, right? Like there's a massive amount of choice. And even if you do decide to go loud, there's a bunch of choice in, well, do you use the weapons that are just auto aim weapons, the smart weapons? Or do you do what I ended up doing a lot of the time, which is I would sneak in, ping an enemy so that I could see all the other enemies that were near them through the walls, and then pull out this rifle that could charge up and shoot through walls. So I was just aiming at dudes like holograms through walls, and I basically never came in contact with them while I was trying to clear them out. And so there's a massive amount of choice in how you want to play it, and I think if you do just go into it playing it as a first-person shooter, you'll probably be less thrilled with it than if you go into it with some of these more creative, weird solutions. Yeah.
So open your mind is the the big takeaway. All right, before we wrap this up, the big question, Tom. Now, this is one of the most hyped games, not just of 2020, but probably of the last few years. After 16 hours, that's a pretty good taste. Is it living up to the hype for you so far? Obviously, there's a lot more to see. We're not reviewing the game yet. It's not quite done, but what is your consensus thus far?
Yes and no, I think is the answer so far, in that it is a really, really cool game. I'm really enjoying it. That said, I would temper hype in just a little bit of a way, in that people, I think, maybe are building this up to be, an incredible, perfect game. It still has rough edges. When The Witcher 3, an incredible game, launched, it had a lot of rough edges with like UI stuff and things like that. This game still has that. That doesn't mean it's not incredible and living up to my excitement of it. It absolutely is. But also, it doesn't mean that like the quest log in Cyberpunk is not a mess, right? And so I think that's a yes and no situation for me. It is living up to the hype and how much I'm enjoying it, but also there are parts of this game that, you gotta remember it is still a video game made by human beings, and there's gonna be rough edges there that you gotta live with.
Well, be sure to go read Tom's final preview, which will be much more in-depth than this, 7-8 minute conversation was. Check that out on IGN.com and stay tuned for our review of Cyberpunk 2077 coming up in the not-too-distant future, finally, on IGN.com.